Hi, everybody in the Taino DNA and genealogy family. This is Natalie Huber Rodriguez coming at you from Washington, D.C. For those of you who don't know me, I am of Cuban Taino descent on my mother's side, and I am also a sociocultural anthropologist and folklorist, and the latter is what I'm going to be dealing with tonight, because I'm going to be talking to you about a very prominent figure, or what has become a prominent figure of Taino folklore and mythology, particularly in the Dominican Republic. So all you Dominicans out there, you may already know who and what I'm talking about, but I'll just give a little background anyway. So this is a creature that has become very big in the Dominican Republic, and even to some degree in Haiti as well, in all of Hispaniola, very recognizable, and has been believed for a long time to be of Taino origin in terms of its characteristics. What I'm going to be talking about tonight is that may be true, or at least a big part of that may be true, but when it comes to myth making, really, and things like folklore, especially in colonized countries, where lots and lots of waves of lots of different people of all different backgrounds and all different belief systems have come through, it's usually not as cut and dry as that. So for those of you Dominicans probably who haven't guessed yet, or anybody else who may already know, the creature I'm talking about is the Ciguapa, or La Ciguapa. So what is a Ciguapa? In the most simple terms, what I like to describe a Ciguapa as is being similar to a nymph, a wood nymph, like those of Greco-Roman mythology. Basically, when I say, what I mean by that is they are these kind of wild, beautiful, female, usually humanoid creatures that live in these remote areas of the wilderness and are very connected to nature. Very, very beautiful, as I said, but also very shy and elusive. And with Ciguapa, as we'll get into in a few minutes, they can also be rather dangerous. So what does Ciguapa look like? As I already mentioned, they're humanoid, female, usually beautiful female, and they're normally described as having either very dark brown, bronze skin, but sometimes also as having blue skin, depending on what region you're in and who you speak to, because it can vary. But they're all described as, when you see them, they're nude completely, and they have this very long, beautiful, glossy, shiny black hair that kind of covers their bodies and drapes around them. Now, this description so far, particularly if we go to the idea of the Ciguapas having the brown or bronze skin, and from what I've seen in terms of depictions of them in art and how they're described, those features do seem to line up with what the native Taino and other indigenous people in those areas would have looked like. The dark brown, bronze skin, the straight, long black hair. That does seem pretty consistent with what a Taino woman of the time would probably look like. The blue skin, obviously, I don't know where that came from. That's a different version. That theory doesn't really make sense there. But so that's kind of our first clue into that. They definitely are said to look more like indigenous women than, say, European women or African women. The one thing that everybody agrees on, though, when it comes to the Ciguapa and what is their most notable and defining feature, is that their feet are backwards. They face completely backwards than human people's feet, or humans' feet do. Sorry. So why is this? Some people say it's because the Ciguapa are very shy and very elusive, and they don't like people, and they like to avoid people as much as possible. So having these backwards feet makes them very difficult to track or to find. because obviously having backwards feet, when they're walking in a particular direction, their footprints are then going to be backwards too. So if somebody tries to follow these footprints, they're going to go in the wrong way that the Ciguapa went. They say that there is one very specific way to track a Ciguapa if you want to. And that is, you need, on the night of a full moon, you need a black and white polydactyl dog. What polydactyl means, 5 toes on the front paws. Most dogs normally only have 4. There is a mutation, a rare mutation that sometimes occurs with both cats and dogs, where they will have these 5 toes. So those dogs, I believe, from what I remember, they're called Cigueño dogs, again relating to the 5 toes, and only they are the ones who can really track a Ciguapa. But it said, even if you do find and track a Ciguapa and subdue and trap it, it will probably die of sadness within a day, because they are wild, free, nature-loving creatures, and to lock them up in captivity is so depressing and heartbreaking for them that they'll just die of a broken heart. The thing I wonder, though, is why you would want to capture a Ciguapa, because from what most accounts say, despite the fact that they do tend to avoid people and try to stay as elusive and hidden from people as possible, sometimes they do encounter people and they're not happy when this happens. And it's usually men, men who, for whatever reason, have to be wandering out in these remote areas late at night. So this could be travelers, hunters, loggers, whoever would have to be doing that. So when the Ciguapa see these men kind of invading their territory, they're, like I said, they're not happy. They get very upset. So what they'll do is they will lure the men with their beauty, because these men are out here in the wilderness for God knows how long, and then they see this beautiful young naked woman come frolicking through the forest. And once the men follow after them, the Ciguapa will then either eat them, kill them, both, or keep them prisoner. In some versions, where they'll just kind of never allow them to leave the forest. They'll kind of be trapped as their slaves or their prisoners, and forced to make love to them for all of eternity, for the rest of their lives. That's what I've read in a few instances. So as I said, they can be very, very dangerous, and it is best to avoid them. Should you encounter one, should you be out alone in a remote area and see this naked, beautiful young woman beckoning to you, do not go near her. And so in here, we kind of start to get an idea of what is commonly believed to be a creature that is reminiscent of a succubus, or a succubus type creature. What I mean by that is any female creature of folklore and mythology who uses her beauty, her sexuality, her allure to lure usually men to a very ill fate, be it death, madness, a variety of awful, awful, horrible things. Succubus type creatures are more common in Western folklore, female demons, and like I said, the nymphs I mentioned before, there are some dangerous ones like that throughout Europe and Western Asia. But they are found in other cultures as well. This idea of this dangerous woman, this very beautiful, very alluring woman, who is also very dangerous and more or less a monster, and who will show that true nature once she has a man kind of in her grasp. So the idea of a Ciguapa being a kind of succubus does sort of make sense. And as I mentioned, there are tons and tons of similar stories of similar creatures throughout folklore. But the funny thing about the Ciguapa that kind of differentiates them is the feet, those backwards feet. Those are a very kind of unique trait to them. But there are creatures that are similar to them in other parts of Latin America, that are more or less succubi type creatures as well. You know, this illusion of a beautiful woman, who then ends up being being a very demonic or vicious creature that will kill you, eat you, drive you mad, keep you prisoner, what have you. So one example that I found is, it's called the Shiwanaba, or sometimes the Ciguanaba, or sometimes the Sigua or Segua. And even in that word alone, you can kind of hear the similarity to Ciguapa, Sigua, Segua, Ciguanaba. That is because that root that it comes from, Segua, is technically a Nahuatl word meaning woman. And what Nahuatl is it's the language of the Aztecs, or Aztecan people, those being obviously the indigenous people of Mexico and Mesoamerica. So the idea that this word that kind of became prominent in the Dominican Republic, coming from these Aztec speaking peoples, isn't so outlandish because they are geographically close. And it is believed in a lot of circles that the original Taino, or who became the Taino, actually first were natives in Mesoamerica, who then migrated over to the Caribbean islands and thereby became the Taino people. So there they would have this sort of common shared ancestry and therefore language and belief system too. So the Ciguanaba, or the Ciwanaba, Sigua, Segua, multiple different words, pardon me, is very common in Mexico and Central American folklore. So obviously that makes sense, as I was just saying, it comes from this Aztecan word, and that's where the Aztecs were. So basically the idea of the Sigua or Segua is very similar to the Ciguapa in that she appears as a beautiful woman, again, very long hair, long, beautiful black hair, normally kind of either semi-nude or sometimes dressed in a sort of like gauzy, flimsy white dress, you know, whatever looks sexiest to anybody, I guess. And basically she'll lure men out on late nights, again, in remote areas, where they shouldn't be anyway. And once she does, she'll then, for the most time, her face is kind of sort of semi, I guess, hidden. She either doesn't look at the men, or her hair is kind of partially covering her face. But they can see from the back and everything that for all intents and purposes, she looks to be a beautiful woman. But then at the kind of moment of truth, she'll turn around or pull back her hair and reveal her face to actually be that of a horse, or a horse's head, or in some cases just a skull. And she will then do what she wants with the man, which normally is kill him, eat him, or sometimes the man will just go insane by the mere sight of her and how frightening it is, or he'll just die of fright in some cases. Either way, it never ends good for him. So that's the Sigua or Segua. As you can see, a lot of similarities there. And then another creature which is kind of in that same vein that I came across was La Sayona. La Sayona is a very popular creature in Venezuela in particular. It's said that she is the vengeful spirit of a woman whose husband cheated on her with her mother. Yeah, of all things. So the poor woman, once she finds out about this, she went insane, in a fit of rage and jealousy, killed both her husband and her mother. And then forever after that, she was cursed to be a vengeful spirit who would prey particularly on unfaithful men who were cheating on their wives and girlfriends and everything. But she probably took any man she could get, from what I can tell too. So very similar to the Mexican Central American Segua. She appears to be a beautiful woman, normally with that long black hair again and flimsy white dress, something like that. Men see her, think, ooh, here we go, follow her off into the wilderness, wherever she is, wherever they are. It's usually, again, in a remote area. And then when she finally reveals her face, it's normally either a skull or some kind of just hideous demonic face with these long, really carnivorous fangs that she uses to then kill, devour, suck the blood of her victims. So as you can see, there's some common themes here that do kind of line up with the themes of the Ciguapa's character as well. So it's definitely adds credence to the idea that this is something that comes from an indigenous origin, be it Taino in the Dominican Republic, the Aztec in the Mexican Central America, the natives of Venezuela for where the Sayona comes from. There seems to be these common traits that are likely more associated with the Aboriginal inhabitants of those places. But some people argue that it actually is more likely that it comes, those types of creatures, maybe their appearance and their, I don't know, certain behavior may come from indigenous folklore. But a lot of people have argued that the idea of them being these succubi type creatures that just kill men after luring them with their beauty, people say that comes more from the colonial and colonist mindset, and particularly the Christian colonist mindset. This idea that women were pretty much no good, and that in a good medieval Christian colonial society, you had to be careful, men in particular had to be careful of women, and particularly beautiful women. Women had just one job, and that was to procreate and then take care of the children in the household. Men had to be very wary of letting themselves be taken in by these beautiful, freer women, less inhibited women, as you would say. And then you could almost connote from that these idea of these women being more sexually liberated as well. But if you allow yourself as a man to kind of be roped in by that beautiful facade and everything, you'll realize too late that said woman is actually just a monster who will be your undoing and will be the end of you. So a lot of people think that idea, at least, with it being specifically a female creature who uses her beauty to lure men to their deaths or similar fates, would come more from a colonialist and Christian colonialist mindset, because it seems more fitting with the beliefs of that culture, which I believe does make sense as well, because from what I know, at least, Taino women and women in other indigenous societies were not regarded in such a way as kind of these lesser, lower beings who were more akin to, animals and demons and things you had to be careful and be wary of, because they were always just up to no good. That doesn't seem very in keeping with what I know about a lot of Taino history and culture, and other the history and culture of other indigenous people as well. Women were not viewed in such a negative light like that. But anyway, moving on from that, the one thing that those two creatures that I mentioned, the Segua and the Sayona, don't really have in common with the Ciguapa is there's no mention of any kind of deformity or issues with the feet or legs, like what is so, iconic of the Ciguapa. With them, it's the face that is deformed somehow. Either it's the head of a horse, a skull, something awful. But the idea of this some kind of abnormality with the feet is not limited to the Ciguapa. Through my research, I was able to find several other creatures throughout Latin America and the Caribbean as well that have kind of a similar issue with their, not similar in the sense that their feet are on backwards too, but it's always seems to be foot related things. For example, one of them was a creature I found called the pata sola, which for those of you who speak Spanish translates to 1 foot. She is very common in South America, South American folklore. And again, she is a beautiful woman who, in the long white dress or maybe naked, semi-naked, beautiful long black hair, lives in these remote areas, normally the jungles and the mountains, and is said to particularly prey on hunters, loggers, again, any men who might be out there all by themselves in these remote areas. Uses her beauty to lure men away. But the thing that kind of gives her away for what she is she only has 1 leg. The other is either completely missing and is normally bandaged, like a bloody bandage stump, they say, or sometimes she'll even have some kind of peg leg or prosthesis of some sort that she'll be hobbling along with. But either way, once she manages to lure and trap a man, she will usually do the same as every other creature we've talked about will do: kill them, eat them, make them her slave or prisoner, and they realize too late, because they've let themselves be taken in by this beautiful creature, that this creature is actually a monster. Another example is this creature called a tunda. Now, the tunda, from what I've heard, is big in the coastal regions of both Colombia and Ecuador, but particularly with the African community, I guess, the descendants of slaves who were brought to those locations. So the tunda, unlike the others, isn't said as being specifically female. It's said to be a shapeshifter that can pretty much take any form. It usually will resemble a human female, but it can also take the shape of somebody's child, mother, father, loved one in some way, which helps them obviously to lure that person into their trap. And this creature also has 1 leg, and the other leg, the one that's missing, is normally replaced by some kind of wooden apparatus, which a lot of people say is in the shape of what looks like a molenillo, or a wooden kind of whisk. It's a kitchen utensil that you use for stirring and beating things. So that's is what they say is the giveaway for that creature. But if you're not sharp enough to spot it and you happen to fall into the tunda's trap, again, you'll probably be killed, eaten, have your blood drained, made a prisoner. Yeah, blah, blah, blah. Same old story. We're seeing a theme here. The thing about the tunda that's interesting is it does mention that this creature, being mainly in Colombia and Ecuador, is more prominent among the African community there, which kind of goes back into the original debate of the Ciguapas, which was, well, is the Ciguapa Taino? Is the Ciguapa Spanish? Is the Ciguapa maybe even of African origin? Now, from what I could tell, I didn't find any particular creatures in African folklore that match the Ciguapa enough where I could say definitively, it's like, obviously that's where it comes from. I mean, there's the Jengu, or plurally the Miengu, which are basically water spirits. They're common among the groups of Cameroon, the various ethnic groups and tribal groups there. They're similar in that they're also these kind of wild, beautiful, nymph-like female humanoid creatures. They're often akin or likened to mermaids, but they don't necessarily have to have those fish tails, but they do reside in water, or in or around bodies of water. The difference with them is that, unlike the Ciguapa or pretty much any of the other creatures we've mentioned tonight, they are not malevolent. They're not known for, luring men and attacking them, killing them, drowning them, since they're in water, whatever you could do, which is obviously very different. They don't fall into this succubus idea in that case. So I would say don't really kind of match up enough where I would make that conclusive connection between them and Ciguapa. Actually, it says, as long as you worship them and you're good to the water, they'll take care of you. So they seem pretty much the opposite of Ciguapa in that way. There's other creatures called Aziza, which are common in Africa, which are thought to be the equivalent of sort of fairies, like the European fairies that we think of, but not really looking in that same way. They're more just small, beautiful spirits of nature, but again, non-malevolent, non-succubi type beings, not trying to lure anybody to their deaths. The only thing I could find that was sort of similar in that sense was this creature called the Obaifo, which is basically a vampire type being that is common to West Africa among the folklore of the Ashanti people and the Dahomey people. Basically, it's also a shapeshifter, and is also considered some kind of witch too, which for us connotes the idea of a female, because in European folklore, witches usually were female, but in African folklore, and actually in the folklore of pretty much almost every other culture besides European or Western, witches could be men or women. So the Obaifo isn't necessarily female, but it does have the power to shapeshift apparently. And what it does is it basically emits a light, kind of a phosphorescent light, they say, or bioluminescent light, that is said to lure people. And once it does lure those people, it feeds on their blood. So that's why I likened it to a vampire. Again, some similarities to the Ciguapa, not so much where I would say, yep, this is definitely where it comes from. To me, based on the evidence that we've gone through, it seems much more probable that the Ciguapa, at least in appearance and to some degree its behavior, the things that it is associated with, like nature, kind of being a sort of guardian of the wilderness and the wild, probably comes from Taino lore and mythology, or in other parts of the world, whoever the natives happen to be. But this idea of them being these very malevolent, very dangerous creatures who will kill men and or make them go mad, anything, all these bad things, does seem like it could be more of a colonial construct, or a Christian impression that was maybe put upon these creatures during colonization. And what I mean by that is that perhaps the Ciguapa and other things like the Segua or the Sayona, the Patasola, everything all existed before in the folklore of the indigenous people. But then during colonization and the forced Christianization of the indigenous people, forcing them to give up all their old spiritual beliefs and adopt Christianity, that meant forgetting all their old gods, all their old spirits that they venerated. It may have been the Spanish colonials that turned these creatures that may have once been benevolent, highly venerated, powerful spirits into suddenly these more demonic type beings. And that happened pretty much anywhere Christians went, and forcibly converted people to Christianity. Even in early Europe, when the first Christians were kind of making their way through Europe, and there were still a lot of pagan Europeans, like the Celts and the Nordic people, who believed in their original spirits and gods, fairies, elves. What Christianity did was said, okay, well, all those things now that you believe in are demons. They are bad. They're malevolent. They'll kill you. They'll pretty much, they're not good. And if you want to go to heaven, and if you want to live a good life, you need to, if you're going to believe in them, you need to avoid them. They're bad things. Just like in the same way we mentioned witches earlier, Christianity turned pretty much any woman in particular who had any kind of, either medicinal knowledge or traditional ecological knowledge, women who had powers of, you say, more spiritual powers, who acted as shamans, anything of that nature, were automatically branded as witches. This is a common theme we see in colonization, when Christian nations colonize non-Christian nations and non-Christian people. They turn all their original beliefs, if, you know, other than if they don't squash them immediately, which they did too, but, you know, easier said than done. They'll really twist them into something much, much worse than they once were. So that's what my personal belief is when it comes to the Ciguapa. And that's what I think the evidence shows, really, is that obviously there is definitely some Taino indigenous origin and lore in here when it came to the myth making of these creatures. But I think maybe that more malevolent aspect to them might have been a later addition placed there by colonization and the Spanish colonials in particular. Now, what we often find, one more thing I should mention, that occurs in cases of colonization, and particularly when you're talking about the colonization where there's multiple ethnic, linguistic groups of people with all different backgrounds and beliefs, which was the case in the Caribbean and Latin America, is you get this kind of process of, we call it syncretism, meaning basically it's the combination of all these different belief systems that kind of make something new. So the Ciguapa, I would say, could definitely be a result of that as well. It could draw from old Taino folk beliefs of these wild beings that were forest spirits. The African slaves who were brought there probably brought with them their own beliefs of similar creatures. And then, you know, the Spanish colonials put on their own agenda of these more succubi, evil type demonic women that came into the mix too. Syncretism occurs in all different forms and in all different ways. Other examples of such things are, say, the religion Santeria, which is big in Cuba, where my family is from. That's a prime example of how the beliefs of the indigenous people, the Taino, plus the African people who were brought over and their tribal and indigenous beliefs, particularly the Yoruba people, blended with the religion and belief of their colonizers, that being Catholic Christianity, and created this kind of brand new thing that was all its own, but that drew elements from multiple different sources. So that's what I've come to the conclusion of, and that is often the case when it comes to folklore. I mean, folklore is not static. It is constantly changing and evolving based on new influences, and the more and more connected and globalized we become as a world, the more influences get added, the more stories get changed, the more descriptions get changed. So something that is one way now was likely not described in that very same way 100 years ago, and will likely not be even the same as it is now 100 years hence. So it's a very fascinating thing, this kind of constant shifting dynamic of folklore and these sort of deeper meanings behind them that I briefly touched on. Again, like this colonial Christian idea of women as, you know, being dangerous, demonic, lesser beings. One could also even maybe draw out of that because the Ciguapa looked more like native women, it was yet another statement of how the colonists were trying to say, oh, look, the native people are these savage, brutal, more monster-like or animal-like wild creatures that will just kill you as soon as look at you. So there's a lot you could really deconstruct with this, and I think that's really what the beauty of folklore is that it's a reflection on the people who created it, and the many, in this case, the many different people who created it, of many different backgrounds and many different belief systems, and the way it has kind of shifted over time and evolved over time into what it is today is really fascinating. And you can really kind of look at it in so many ways and take it as you will. I mean, again, I'm only going by what I know as an academic, and as someone who studied this. For those of you out there, say, who are maybe from the Dominican Republic and grew up there, heard stories of Ciguapa, maybe it means something completely different to you. Maybe to you, it was just, oh, this is the stories our parents told us, so we wouldn't go wandering out in the middle of remote areas like the woods or the mountains at night because it's dangerous. And that's, you know, that was often a more base function of folklore and folk tales too, was to try to keep children safe or teach lessons, teach morals, keep people from doing things that were bad or were harmful or dangerous. And then for some of you, it might mean something completely different. And that's the beauty of it. It doesn't have to mean the same thing to everyone. So if you guys have your own thoughts on what you think of this particular myth of Ciguapa based on what I've said, or even from your own background or from other sources that you've heard, feel free to share. I love being able to talk about it and exchange all these ideas in dialogue. That's how we learn. Other than that, I hope you've all enjoyed this presentation, and I hope you all are keeping safe and healthy and well in this pandemic time, and hopefully it'll be over soon and we can all get back to being together as we should be. So, ha home everybody, and have a good night.